All right, next installment, we're going to talk a little bit about the social and behavioral dimensions of health. So to review, we talked about health decision-making and what were all the things that figured into that. So we talked very briefly about the concept of informed decision-making or informed consent and choice. And that's typically governed by clinical expertise, which we hope most of the time is also going to be influenced by data. Clinical expertise, and actually what falls under the umbrella of evidence-based practice, is not just data, is also clinical anecdote and clinical experience. It is not insignificant that even if it doesn't show up in the data, that a clinician who has been working with thousands and thousands of patients, and truly from that speaking has data points, are thousands of data points, is going to have a lot to say about what they've seen and not seen. But the key for us to always understand, and this is for myself as well, it is something that we have to openly acknowledge and own and take accountability for, that even though our expertise counts, it is not objective. It is most definitely biased, and there's always going to be any clinical expertise that we offer strictly through the lens, or strictly as clinical anecdote or even clinical experience, will always come through the lens of bias, will always come through the lens of our own personal values, and also what we seeing what we want to see, right? So if there's certain outcomes that we value, certain outcomes that we devalue, certain areas of improvement that we want to identify, we will also highlight the clinical expertise, anecdote, experience, and quote unquote data points that elucidate that for the purpose of informed choice or informed consent. Also, if we think that we properly understand this patient, we are going to deliver information in a way and with the kind of data points or facts, so to speak, that we think are the most relevant to this person. So we are also biased in our assessment of that person that may not necessarily be wholly objective. Now, is it possible to be wholly objective as a clinical provider? No. I mean, that's the reality, right? So it is not unforgivable or, or unreasonable as a patient to question the provider, but also to really understand that, it is not also with malintent that providers provide this information in certain ways. Sometimes it actually is, but very rarely is that the truth. I mean, being in healthcare for as long as I have, interacted with thousands of healthcare providers, whether they're of my own designation or, other colleagues that I refer to or, provide adjunct care with, I genuinely do think and believe, clinical anecdote, that most of the providers I interact with really do want to help people, but that they have a certain sense of what helps people, and that it may not actually be consistent with patients think will help them. There is also a certain power dynamic and a certain superiority that's built into being a healthcare provider, especially if you've had to achieve a certain level of education, pay a certain amount of dues to get where you are. There's a generational piece to this too, that when you've gotten to a certain age, level of years in the field, and a certain level of education, and maybe you're of certain populations that have a certain level of seriousness attributed to them, you can take yourself very seriously, and to think that your level of clinical expertise trumps the expertise of the person you are working with, and that can sometimes interfere or short circuit the process of shared decision making versus informed decision making. So clinical expertise is valuable, 100%. It is actually under the umbrella of evidence-based practice, and it is not the only way that we could make healthcare decisions, although it is the way that a lot of people do, because it is difficult to understand data and to know where it comes from and how it arrives. And we've talked also a little bit about that. It is also difficult to understand different presentations of data. It might come in a social media form that we don't really relate to. It may come in a more sensationalized form that we don't really relate to. It might come in conjunction with a product that we don't consume. It may come in conjunction with lifestyle measures that don't feel like they're for us, because the pictures and the vehicles like gyms and, kale and salmon don't feel like they're in our reach. So presentation of data and presentation of health measures may not necessarily also relate to us. And so, or they might, and then that might be what sways our decision making. We might not see ourselves in that risk or probability category because, oh, we're not, the pregnant perinatal person, who is 35 years old. We are not the person that has been designated to have a too high BMI and be in an older age category. We may not be the people with end stage cancer. So we don't necessarily see ourselves in those people. So we don't actually think that those decisions or health choices or health outcomes relate to us. And then we have our own individual assessment, which is going to come from our values. But our individual assessment is also going to encompass all of these other social and behavioral influences. And so this is what we talk about as the social dimensions of health. And this list and the diagram we'll look at on the next slide can get way bigger depending on how you want to model this. The standard influences we have thought about is more from the social systemic perspective. So meaning that like finances, values, culture, religion, healthcare access, so literally meaning like whether or not you have a passage to the healthcare system, which has changed over time, transportation and proximity to healthcare services, food security and other lifestyle measures, and whether or not, and then also sort of like the personal well-being, spiritual component, whether or not you are well or not, or well appointed in any one of those categories or none of them, can absolutely determine whether or not you have health from the way that we classically define it. And that's absolutely true. When we actually look at the data, is that when we see that people are missing even one of those categories, but certainly multiple of those categories, which tends to overlap in similar populations, they are absolutely going to have far less health, even if they have the data and a healthcare provider who provides them with information, and they are seeing themselves in that risk and probability data, and even if their values line up, but that when there are so many systemic features, circumstantial features of their lives that don't help shuttle them towards or direct them towards health behaviors or health choices, it is going to be difficult to achieve health, even if they actually want that to be true, even if they believe that it's possible. So what are these influences? Some of the things that are in the diagram we'll see, but also like psychology and human behavior. So we talked a little bit about that, like what generates trust, what generates relationship, how can we understand those things, not just to leverage them, but also to understand where they are being patently ignored, where relationship and trust are actually not part of the equation. And that is one of the most pivotal reasons why people aren't actually interacting with that healthcare information, data, communication. Sociology and systems impact. So just the idea that the way society works, and also whether it feels like it works for you, right? If it feels like this, this is a society I'm in, but nothing about the way it's structured is oriented towards helping me and my family and the people of my community. Looking at even just like anthropological and cultural normative practices. So like, what is actually even our cultural value of health? Does it line up with me and my culture? And I don't mean that necessarily from like a global culture perspective, but it could be like your family culture. Culture can have many levels to it, and they could be parallel or, synchronous, or they can, take priority or hierarchy over each other. But sometimes the culture we are in, whether it's, a different community, a different society, doesn't actually reflect the mores and the values and the ways in which we live. The other pieces are public policy and government. And we're seeing that live as we speak right now, that some of the ways that people can't achieve health, some of the ways that people die in childbirth, they didn't want to be pregnant in the first place. And didn't have any options. And so that was what happened. So they didn't want to be in that risk and probability category. They wanted the information and the choice. They weren't given that. So there are a lot of different reasons why people are struggling with their ability to attain health. And it's not always that, they just didn't want it. They didn't try hard enough. They just didn't make the right decisions, which, if you're being honest, how many of you think that way? How many of you have been taught to think that way, that health is purely right here in your hands and that your outcomes are a 1-to-1 ratio, your choices, your outcomes. And we'll see in the diagram economics, microeconomics and macroeconomics. So when we're looking at sort of like the larger scale, country, like what do we put money towards? How much does healthcare cost? One hospitalization can cost, $500,000. How do we ration, honestly, healthcare to those costs? A lot of countries that have more what we call socialized or universal healthcare systems tend to look at healthcare costs from a macro standpoint. It's like, okay, well, we can offer this service, say routine mammograms for all people starting at 35. And when we actually offer that, yes, it costs a lot of money for all people who have breasts. Yes, it costs a lot of money. And what is saved on the other end is early detection and far less advanced cancer diagnoses, which are way more expensive down the line. So it is much more useful to spend money up front for the purpose of avoiding that very further downstream and insanely expensive healthcare costs later. Micro is obviously going to be our expenses, right? What do we have money for? Do we have money for the gym? Do we have money to get to the gym? Because gas costs $6 a gallon. Do we have, time is money. Any time that I dedicate to my self-care, whether, say it's an hour or 2 hours, means it's, an hour or 2 hours, I'm not working. Is my body my vehicle for my economic well-being? And if it's true, then every place I put it somewhere else, not into my economic gain, means it takes money away from me and my family. Not just, communication strategies we talked about. Some of it is the vehicle of communication. Some of it is the mode, like, is it audio? Is it visual? Is it, is it meeting a variety of ways of learning also? But also, is it fear-based? Is it wellness-based? Is it talking to the risk-averse people? Is it talking to the risk-tolerant people? There's a lot of strategies that we utilize, and some of this came out through the pandemic as well, that it's like, if you don't do this thing, everybody will die, versus, which I think there was also that conversation happening. Some people really rejected that way of conveying information. And there was also some information of like, hey, this is a really nice way of thinking about how your behavior protects other people. What's interesting is that what we found is that more people actually responded to fear-based tactics than not, right? That avoiding pain was actually a much more prescient and precious communication strategy than encouraging well-being, community well-being, and individual well-being. And that's true, even in terms of like business and marketing and getting people to buy products. A lot of it is like, if you don't have this, it's a scarcity mentality. If you don't have this, who are you? And then looking at demographics and geography, right? So thinking about like regional stuff. Even within our country, it's like we have 7 different countries. Thinking about not only just the language, but also what are the unique cultural features in each geography? Even just thinking about Washington State itself, the same strategy for King County doesn't work anywhere east of the mountains, because you could actually have to travel 3 hours to go see a provider in Moses Lake. Whereas in King County, even if you have to take the bus from one neighborhood to another neighborhood, it might take you 2 hours, and that's not great. But the reality is it's 15 miles away versus 115. So this is sort of the standard diagram. Move this video out of the way a little bit. In terms of what we consider the major contributions to health status and well-being. And this is really important when we talk about public health. Like, we cannot take social dimensions of health out of the public health conversation. And yet we often do. And this was one of those things that I think that also became very highlighted in a lot of mistrust and dissonance in public health messaging, is that people really looked to provide what felt to a lot of people like a one-size-fit-all kind of strategy, which is sometimes what public health is doing, right? It's public, it's a big umbrella, and didn't necessarily consider the social dimensions of health of all different peoples, or the geography or the cultural nuances. And that, as I said in class last week, that we probably needed 7 different public health messages to account for the people who didn't see themselves in the elder population or the at-risk population, the people who didn't see themselves in those, who lived in more rural environments are like, why do I have to stay in my house? I literally live 5 miles from my next door neighbor, and I go into town once a week to a small market. Why do I literally have to stay in my house? On the flip side, what could have been discussed is like, you are also 3 hours from emergent healthcare services that could provide life-saving interventions should you need them. And I think that these are nuances. The social dimensions of health provide nuances to public health messaging that makes it really difficult to figure out, like, so how do we communicate something for the whole public and the population that feels relevant, while still also accounting for the fact that it has to be individualized? And somewhere in between those things lies perfection, but we are still struggling with that from a public health perspective and from an individual health perspective. So this video linked here, and it's not very long, is really fascinating to look at how zip code actually determines your health. And partly what they're looking at there is that because zip code actually accounts for so many things, it accounts for housing, economics, schools, grocery stores, gas stations, corner stores, fast food restaurants, regular grocery stores, so to speak, transportation options. So when you look at zip code, it actually tells you a lot about all the other dimensions of health that fall under the social dimensions of health. We show this video quite a bit when we are teaching. So there's a specific course in the health studies curriculum called Social Dimensions of Health. It's a whole course where we go really in depth into each of these topics, like how does behavioral health, how does zip code, how does healthcare access truly impact health, and for who, and in what ways. But this is a really great introduction to how the zip code can account for a lot of the social dimensions of health and how impactful it really is in order to understand how messaging might want to be really different. There's also, the personal pieces of like the dimensions of health and beliefs. And so we've talked a little bit about this in this video and the one prior, and then even in class too, that there are personal characteristics that we have. Now, this is incredibly hard to account for, but I think that this is a really important thing for us to look at when we go back to the very first question that I asked you, which is, how do you make health decisions? And a lot of it is this, what is your own susceptibility? Or how do you understand that, right? Either with data or your own, N of 1 evidence, which is I'm not dead yet. The severity, like what is the severity of the illness, and how do you manage those types of illnesses in your history, if you know? What are the benefits and the barriers, for you to pursue these particular health behaviors or avoid these health outcomes? Is there a benefit to that? It's like, well, no, there's no appreciable benefit to me wearing a mask out in public because I don't actually see anybody out there. What are the barriers? Well, I do have, several different chronic health concerns. And so it really makes it difficult for me to actually engage in some of these health behaviors. And then there's also the individual characteristics. So we talked a little about risk aversion, risk tolerance, but also our own cues for action and readiness. Some of us are pre-contemplative, contemplative people. We are not action-oriented people. And that can be personality traits that can be gifted to us by our own upbringing, possibly our trauma. We might have seen adverse reactions to either being inactive or overly active or hasty. I always like to joke about myself that I'm very action oriented, very risk tolerant, which is why I think my risk tolerance makes it possible for me to be more action oriented. I always joke that, like, if I want something done, I got it done yesterday. When I'm thinking about a project or like, this might be a good idea, I start moving on it immediately. When I'm feeling like I just don't feel super balanced. I'm already putting things in place, like clearing things off my schedule and putting things in place. But that's my personality trait. You know, it's not just that, like, yes, I have other things that line up that support that. Like right now I have more flexible work. So than being in, you know, in a clinical setting for 14 hours a day. So I can do a lot of those things that I couldn't do before. But a lot of it is also our personal, I'll say our operating system, right? Like whether we are people who are like that, I'm in, versus that, I'm going to hang back here for a little bit. And that might not have anything to do with our social dimensions of health, but it could also be related to that, and our history of trauma and the ACEs, which I brought up in our first class, the adverse childhood events, and our own sense of self-efficacy, which could also be related to trauma and ACEs. You know, if you have not had a life where you were efficacious, where you were in control of what happened to you, and a lot of things happened to you that were out of your control and that maybe were at least affected you and possibly affected you in a negative way, your self-efficacy is definitely going to be lower. It's going to be harder to make health decisions. And this is well documented that people who have experienced trauma typically, right, these are all data points, have a much harder time making health decisions because their locus of control has been displaced from them over the course of their life. So they haven't necessarily felt in control of their life. Some people have a response that in response to trauma, I want to control everything that comes afterwards. That happens too. But generally speaking, self-efficacy can really be, and our relationship to even being able to engage in health behaviors has a lot to do with the way that we are raised. So here's a little, you know, diagram of like people who are early adopters, people who are the early majority, late majority. This is a really great grid that we use also like in business and media communications, also in public health, and just sort of healthcare in general. But there's always going to be this group of people that are like, that idea, I'm in. I wouldn't necessarily put myself in an innovator group, but I'm definitely an early adopter sort of a lot of things. But there are some people who are like, I'm going to wait and see how many people do the thing, right? So we saw that with vaccine uptake, right? There were a lot of people that are like, I want to wait and see however many people do this thing before I get there. So you can see that that's actually a fairly large part of the majority. So when people were feeling vaccine hesitant, of course they were. That's 34% of the population. A third of the population was already had already decided, I'm going to wait. So truly speaking, we weren't going to get a significant portion of the population immunized until there were the innovators, early adopters, so to speak, you know, the first 15, 16% of people. And then there was what we call the late majority. So the people who are going to come in and say, all right, like most of the people in my life have gotten immunized, I'm going to do it now. So at that point, now we're looking at like, you know, 80% or 85%, about 84% of the population. We don't actually even have that many people immunized, but we can see why this would be true, no matter what the messaging was going to be. This is kind of, generally speaking, how our society shakes out. We talk about this a lot in business too, is that there's the group of people who are like, you know, they're your like dynamos, right? They show up early, they show up to work, they show up at every meeting and every project. They're like, it's not just they're tryhards, but they are just like, this is just how they're wired. They're wired for action. Technically, very often the business owners tend to be those kinds of people. And I'll say, as a longtime business owner, I've always wondered, why don't people like show up to kill it? And it's like, because those people would own the business, is the reality. And that most people fall under the tall part of the bell curve. They're there to work, they're there to do good stuff, like many of you are in this class, but they're not necessarily the people there who are there to kill it. And then there's always a portion of the population that is like on the other end. They're like, yeah, I'll do that. I'll be here waiting. We know this from group work, right? That we know this from workplaces. We know this from group work. Like there's always, you know, that 16%. So in a group of 5, you know, we're talking about 1. Or, you know, in a class where I had 6 groups, you know, doing projects, there's always one group that I'm kind of like, what happened to them? And it almost always plays out this way. I mean, over my years, I've hired and fired probably like 60, 70 people between docs and front desk administration and social workers. And there is a small percentage. Luckily, it's been a very small percentage of people like, the reason I fired them was like, they were in that 16%. So this is this innovation decision-making process. It is everywhere in our society. And so I think that this is also a really interesting reflection for us to figure out, like, where do I fall here? And this is probably also where we're going to fall in terms of health decision-making, in terms of the information that's out there and our relationship to it. And then when we think about, where does health information, who does it need to target? Who does it really need to go out to? That's a really fascinating question. If we figure out who it needs to go out to, we can figure out, like, how innovative does that message need to be? Maybe it doesn't. And maybe sometimes we're focusing too much information on that last 16% that really we were never going to get anyway. So I've seen this in the very pro public health, pro vaccine, crowd, as, again, pertaining to the pandemic, where people were very upset with people who decided not to engage in certain measures. I understand their anger. I understand their frustration. And it was always going to be true that there was a percentage of people who are like, nah, great data, nice infographics, cool clinical experience, great personal anecdote, still not interested. Still going to do what I came to do in this group work, which was, oops. So when we talk about social dimensions of health, what I want to leave you with is, there's the diagram, money, culture, healthcare access, transportation, geography, all that kind of stuff, the zip code. And there are so many other elements of this, which is what makes it so dang complicated, right? Because where do you then, from a public health standpoint, speak to a population of individuals who are all being influenced by this diagram, by their behavioral health attributes, by their personal attributes, by their own, family culture attributes? And at what point do we calibrate the message? Or to what points do we produce, several different messages? And who are going to be the benchmarks for that? We don't have the answers to these questions. These are the questions, honestly, that public health is like racking their brain for. But these are really important things for us to think about, especially given that many of you, all of you, are in really different disciplines and in varying levels of or varying places in your field of study. That I want you to think about, like, for instance, if you're in pharmacy, why doesn't this person take a medication? Why haven't they refilled this? All of this stuff. If you're in nursing, why hasn't this person come back to do their last visit or any of their visits to manage their diabetes? All of this stuff. If you're a person in the pandemic who's mad at the people who didn't do this stuff that you thought was perfectly reasonable and well substantiated, all of this stuff. So when we think about why we make healthcare decisions, that is also why other people make their healthcare decisions too. So I want you to think, at this point, personalize it for you, right? And then the next step is to put it in the place of, okay, how would this relate to my field of study? How would I think about this as a business major? How would I think about this as a psych major or a nursing person or someone in nursing? How would I think about this if I'm thinking about going into health education and promotion? And that's honestly, like, when we think about, like, what's the next right thing that we can do, this is possibly it, right? Is to think about, how can we take this knowledge and at least apply it to the things that we are able to, I won't say control, but influence. All right, enjoy that process.